right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Taline Tokat. I am an inclusion specialist with Early Choices.
Hi, everybody. I'm Emily Ropars. I'm also an inclusion specialist with Early Choices, and we're happy you are joining us today. We are going to start our PowerPoint, and then we're going to turn our cameras off so we're not distracting to you, but we wanted to pop in and say hi so you can see the faces behind the voices.
That's right.
So again, my name is Emily, and we're here to talk about the outstanding practices in inclusion recognition. You can see our contact information is on there should you have any questions after watching today's webinar. So the outstanding practices in inclusion recognition exemplifies a sustainable culture of inclusion. So what we're looking for is programs that inclusion is just so woven into the fabric of their program that it has been inclusive for a time period and it will continue to be inclusive regardless of a change in administration or a change in the community. Inclusion will just remain. We're looking for consistent and exemplary practices in inclusion, both at the program and classroom level. And we want to see that those practices are integral to the whole program. So it's woven into the entire system. As some people say, it's just the way we do business here. We have a number of organizations that help to administer the outstanding practices in inclusion acknowledgement. And one is our organization, Early Choices. We are the Illinois State Board of Education Inclusion Initiative. In addition, the Illinois State Board of Education administers, and then the Early Childhood Least Restrictive Environment Stakeholders Consortium is the third party. The recognition for this acknowledgement occurs biennially at the Sharing a Vision Conference here in Illinois. So I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of the background and the big picture pieces, and then a little bit I'm going to turn it over to Talene, who's going to get into a little bit more of the details. So at each Sharing a Vision conference, we will acknowledge the folks who have received this acknowledgement. And this year, if you're applying, the recognition will occur in 2023. Each time that you have a update to your Circle of Quality, your NACE accreditation, you will need to reapply for the recognition. If you do not have a Circle of Quality through INCRA or you are not accredited through NACE, you will need to reapply every 4 years. When you're thinking about whether your program is ready to pursue this acknowledgement, here are some ideas of things to think about. Does your program have a commitment to achieving the principles of full inclusion, which we will talk about in just a moment? Natural proportions. Do you have a commitment to and are able to demonstrate a full participation of children with disabilities and their families in the least restrictive environment? So I mentioned earlier, we're looking for that culture of inclusion. And now we're thinking about a little bit deeper of what that means. Would you be able to demonstrate these principles and practices? Programs who are eligible to apply will be able to demonstrate that they are a highly rated program through the means that we just mentioned. We will ask districts to provide their educational environments data as evidence that children with disabilities are being included. And then because we know that the folks who support children need to be supported, we also ask for documentation of professional learning that your staff has been provided that specifically support inclusion. Again, to be considered a highly rated early childhood program, you could demonstrate that you have achieved a gold rating from Accelerate Illinois. You can show that you have accreditation through NACE. If you have neither of those, you must be able to use alternate means of showing quality through using those same indicators from Accelerate and the compliance checklist from the Illinois State Board of Education. If you have neither the gold rating nor the NACE accreditation, you will need to reach out to Early Choices so that we're able to help you with this third alternative. So if you are an LEA or a school district, you will need to show us your educational environment data for school-based programs. So 6A is your data that shows children who are enrolled in a regular early childhood program and receive the majority of their special ed and related services in the regular early childhood program. So for your 6A, the district data must be greater than 50%. 6B data shows children who are educated in a separate special education classroom, separate school, or residential facility. 6B data for your district must be less than 20%. If you do not currently have your 6A and 6B data, you can go and look at your district report card on the website that's listed on there. You can reach out to Early Choices and we'll be able to send you that report. And we will ask you if we do not have those two forms of data for you to issue us a local data report. So for a program to be eligible to apply, you need to be able to answer yes to all of these questions. Number one, do at least 10%, but not more than 30% of your enrolled children in each of your inclusive classrooms have disabilities? This is speaking to the natural proportions that we mentioned earlier. Are children with IEPs enrolled in the majority of your classrooms? So when you look at your total number of classrooms, more than 50% of those need to be inclusive, meaning children with IEPs are enrolled in those classrooms. If you have preschool for all or preschool for all expansion dollars, um, you can be considered inclusive only if children have needs in addition to speech. And then for each of those inclusive classrooms, they need to include a majority of children, over 50%, who do not have disabilities. And again, that is from the definition of a regular early childhood classroom. So here's some more details about the professional learning requirement. The program administrator and staff, and when we say staff, that means all the adults who support the classrooms that are inclusive, from paraprofessionals, related service staff, and teachers. So, do all of them have at least 6 clock hours of professional development within the past 3 years from more than one of the following topics? One is assessment of young children with disabilities. Two is enhancing learning for young children with disabilities, specifically about inclusive practices. The third option is collaborating with families in providing education and care to young children with disabilities. You will be asked to provide a spreadsheet to document this information. The professional learning needs to be clearly and explicitly related to children with disabilities, their families, and inclusion. So, for example, if you had a training that your staff went to for teaching strategies gold, if you attended a workshop on ECHRs, those would not qualify because those are not specific to practices um, related to early childhood inclusion. Here's a brief overview of our timeline. So the commitment to apply needs to be submitted by December 16th, 2022. In March of 2023, programs will present to a review panel, and Talene will share some more information about that in just a moment. If the panel recommends that the program move forward to the next step, reliable assessors will visit your program in the spring to assess a sampling of classrooms in your program. And if recommended by that stage, programs will be acknowledged at Sharing a Vision in 2023. So you apply by submitting the eligibility criteria, which is due December 16th, 2022. The link to that is on our website, which we will be sharing with you at the end of this webinar. There is a link on our website for this Google form. which enables you to upload all the relevant documents right into the form. So you'd be able to upload a copy of your 6A and 6B data. You'll be able to upload the spreadsheet of your professional development and give us some background information about your program. So you might be wondering how your program would benefit by going through this process. So we'd like to share with you a brief video from Stock School, who achieved the Award of Excellence for Inclusion, which was the original name for Outstanding Practices in Inclusion.
So some of the outcomes for our program, it was multiple. There were multiple outcomes really. I would say the first was that we had an opportunity to be reflective about our practice and really celebrate our successes. We do a lot of things well, and it gave us the credibility to say we're doing this well. It also highlighted a couple of areas of improvement. So, for example, parent outcomes. We were looking for stronger parent outcomes, parent involvement, things like that. And this gave us very specific ways to improve our interactions with parents. We also were looking for better written policies as an outcome from this. We saw that what we thought was strong wasn't a couple areas we can improve on. So we are redoing our policy manuals. And what else? That's pretty much it as far as our outcomes.
It really reaffirms what we already do here at Stock School, but again, we can always improve in different areas and make those areas stronger.
It also gave more opportunities for reflective conversations and collaborative conversations about our therapists and their push-in. How do they provide services for the children in a classroom? Are we pulling children out of the classroom? More specifically, are we pulling children aside to provide services? So that really gave us an opportunity to have pretty in-depth conversations about how our therapists are supporting the children with special needs in and out of our classrooms.
We also look closely at how we engage children during free choice and how that can be facilitated in a different way.
Okay. So we took a little bit of time now. Emily shared more of the details and overview about OPI, what it's really all about. And so now what we're going to do is take a little bit of time to look at the step-by-step process that comes up in relation to that timeline that Emily had shared with us. One thing that we want to keep in mind, as was mentioned, there are many standards that we use in terms of looking at quality in early childhood programs. You may be using your NACI accreditation, you may be using your Accelerate standards to think about quality. But when we're thinking about the outstanding practices and inclusion, we of course want to be focusing on the inclusion of children with disabilities. So keeping in mind that if you are considering applying, we're really going to be looking at the ways in which high quality practices are implemented throughout your program, specifically how they support children with disabilities. So we want to keep that in mind because we want to be thinking very specifically about inclusion and about those children with disabilities within your program. And we're going to be talking about sort of the different levels of how that support can look within high quality. So as Emily mentioned, ultimately, there is this process that we go through in terms of a timeline. And what that really looks like is taking some time first within your program, within your teams, to be thinking about where you are at in terms of how you are implementing high quality inclusive practices within your program. And if you are having these reflective conversations, as we saw in the video, and have determined that perhaps this is the year that you'd like to apply for this recognition. Essentially, there would be some steps that you would take to prepare as a program and as a team. And then from there, have a presentation that you would do to a panel. And then from there, there are some additional steps that would be taken by that panel to ultimately see if you are recommended for the recognition. So we're going to go through each of those steps. So as I said initially, what would be happening is that ultimately at the end of the day, what we want to know is how your program has a sustainable culture of inclusion throughout at every level of your program, whether that be at the policy level, the procedures that you have, all the way to the practices that are implemented within the classroom. And so we want to share with you some very specific resources and tools that you can use in order to determine how you're feeling about your program strengths and where you feel that you may have some room to grow. One of those key resources is going to be the Illinois Inclusion Guidelines. And these are really the standards that you can use to determine how closely your program is aligning to these standards, how you are doing in terms of many different levels of your program. And so these guidelines are sort of like a map to see where you are at in terms of how you're implementing these practices. There are many different standards within these guidelines, such as learning environment, curriculum, family engagement, continuous quality improvement. And you can essentially use these guidelines as a way to think about how you can bring forth all the evidence of what's happening within your program to demonstrate that you have this culture of inclusion. So these guidelines specifically can really help you have these reflective conversations within your team to determine where you are, what you're implementing really well, and to basically build that evidence to ultimately show at that presentation down the line. And just to keep in mind, this is one of the major resources in thinking about OPI. All of these resources are available on our website, and we will provide links to these resources throughout these slides as well. So again, our initial resource that we really wanted to highlight is those Illinois Inclusion Guidelines. And there's also this Illinois Inclusion Guidelines checklist that works directly in conjunction with that. This is a great resource that you can use in order to guide those conversations with your team again, because it helps you assess where you are in terms of the level of how you've established or developed some of these standards. And just keeping in mind, ultimately, the goal for all of these standards, as you may see on that visual, is to be all the way on that right side of fully established as much as possible throughout this checklist. So this checklist can really help you in determining where you are as a program and within classroom practices as well. Now, all of the standards within the guidelines are very important, but we want to highlight two of the items specifically because they are critical to your preparation as a program in determining if you will apply this year or as farther down the line. So items number 20 and 21 specifically refer to a self-assessment process that needs to be completed by your program. And ultimately, that self-assessment process is to use the inclusive classroom profile to look at all the different items within that profile and determine how your program is specifically supporting children with disabilities. The inclusive classroom profile is our high quality rating scale that we use to determine how those supports are being implemented. And we can think about it a little bit as two different levels of our work that we do. The first part of the assessment really speaks to program level practices, so classroom procedures, policies, what you may be doing for monitoring children's learning or family professional partnerships. And then there's also a part that really speaks to classroom specifics on the practices that support each child. So what's happening within the classroom? How are we fostering a sense of membership, those sorts of aspects that are very specific to individual children. And so as a team, you'll want to go through the inclusive classroom profile and assess where you all are in terms of how you are implementing those practices to determine if this feels like the year to apply for the recognition, or to determine if maybe there are some different types of action plans that may come about first before deciding to apply for recognition. And again, wanting to show as much evidence as possible for those practices if you feel like they are currently fully established in your program. And again, these are all evidence and items that you're going to be using throughout your presentation. So we can talk a little bit about that. So after you've had the time with your team to reflect, to determine where you're at, to see what practices are fully established. You've looked through the Illinois inclusion guidelines, you've done the self-assessment with the inclusive classroom profile, and you've decided to apply. Again, it would be sometime around March 2023 that you would present to a review panel. And so essentially, if you were to decide that you wanted to do that, you would create a presentation demonstrating how you implement these items. You would show the evidence for all of that, any documents, anything from your handbook, PowerPoints, whatever it might be. This would be a 45-minute presentation. And then there would be 15 minutes for the panel to ask further questions if needed. You may recall from that checklist, there was that scale that I pointed out, and on the very right side of the scale, it said fully established. So if you were to present, you would need at least 80% of the items on those guidelines checklist to be fully established in order to be considered ready to move on to the next step of the process. So keeping in mind a 45-minute presentation with 15 minutes for questions, and then requiring at least 80% of the items be fully established in order to be considered ready for the next step. This is just a reminder that that checklist can really be used as a tool to develop your presentation. These are all the different standards and aspects that the panel will want to see. So certainly just using this as your guide is going to be really helpful to make sure you have all the pieces necessary. Now, if it were determined that 80% of those items are fully established, what would happen next is that while you had already done an informal self-assessment with the inclusive classroom profile, the panel would then do a formal assessment using the tool. And so there would actually be, formal scores coming out of that process. And that is something that would happen in the spring after the presentation. And those dates would, of course, be determined with your program. But again, what would be happening is that these formal assessors would be looking at your classroom measures, how you are implementing those practices, how are the children with disabilities being supported within the classroom. So this would be the next step, which is that formal assessment happening after you provided that presentation. We have a very brief video here of someone speaking to the experience of using the inclusive classroom profile to do a self-assessment within their program.
So our classroom team broke that down and worked with the inclusive classroom profile, and this was a really beneficial experience. They took that system and they all took turns observing in the classroom, and they met together as a team and went through each of the areas, and they were able to see where their strengths were, where their weaknesses were, and where they wanted to go next.
So again, just as a reminder, ultimately to be thinking about that presentation, we just want to highlight the fact that what we want to see is that your program clearly demonstrates how you are implementing the standards of the Illinois inclusion guidelines at every level of your program, and how that your program has that interwoven sustainable culture of inclusion throughout each and every day, for all of your kiddos, for all of your families, and for your community ultimately. Again, this is just a reminder that we would use this formal tool to assess. Should we be ready to come and look at your classrooms? And then the inclusive classroom profile has a scoring system, a rating scale of 1 to 7. And so after those observations, your program would require an average score of a 5 in order to receive the recognition. So would it have to be a cumulative score of a 5 on the inclusive classroom profile completed by those formal assessors. And we just have some links here that we wanted to share with you that may be helpful. All of these are also accessible on our website. But you may find that you want to learn a little bit more about the inclusive classroom profile, or just look at some of the planning tools that we have in helping you have some of these conversations around how your program is implementing high quality inclusive practices. This live binder link specifically is using the ICP for self-reflection. So there's a lot of resources very specific to that process within that link that may be of interest to you. We also have a few links here from Brooks Publishing, and these have very specific resource books that you can use that are even broken up by item of the ICP. There's 12 items there, and there's a lot of different resources that can be used to dive deeper into each one, especially if you're feeling you want to take a look at a very specific practice that you've noticed you'd like to improve. And so these links can be particularly helpful for that as well. This is just a reminder again of kind of the process that we've looked at. So if you were interested in applying, the self-assessment and the reflective conversations that would be necessary to determine that. From there would be that formal presentation. If that presentation merited an 80% of the standards being fully implemented, then we would move to scheduling a time for formal assessors to complete the inclusive classroom profile within your program. And then from there, if there was that average score of 5 on the ICP, we would be able to celebrate your program at the next Sharing of Vision conference. So this is really, again, to highlight the step-by-step process that happens should you be interested in applying. So again, all of these resources are available on our website, those guidelines, that checklist, any of the forms that you may need in order to apply if you are interested are all available there as well. And there's a link here on this slide that you can use also. You're also welcome to reach out to us should you have any questions, or you can access our website. You may also be working in conjunction with your StarNet region, so they may have resources for you as well. But otherwise, we also have our email addresses here, so should you ever have any questions or interest in speaking further about this recognition, please feel free to reach out to us at any time, and we'd be happy to speak with you. Thank you so much for joining us.